Hi, everybody. My name is Randy, and I will be your host for today's webinar. It's Explore Trapunto with Mary Beck. Before we start, I have a couple of things for all of you. If you have any questions for the presenter, please type into the questions box. We will have a questions session at the end. The webinar is being recorded and will be available to watch on BERNINA.com and YouTube next week. If you are viewing an Apple product such as an iPad or an iPhone, if you don't see the screen, you might want to swipe left or right. At the bottom left or bottom right corner of your on your screen, there's a more menu which includes our handout for the day. If you experience any audio or video issues once the webinar begins, please follow these steps. Please exit the webinar and then close your internet browser, and then relaunch your browser and then re-enter the webinar. Don't worry about missing anything. Like I said, the webinar is being recorded and will be available on BERNINA.com and YouTube next week. And with that being said, I now turn you over to Mary, who's our presenter for the day, and I will see you all later.
All right, great. So getting ready to share the screen. Let's see. Yeah, let's get the PowerPoint up. All right, great. Thanks, Randy, and hello, everybody. I'm so glad you could join me today on Exploring Trapunto. We're actually going to go on an adventure of what I learned about Trapunto and hopefully can inspire you with some fun things that you can do with your sewing machine. Now, maybe this is a technique that you have done before, so you may have a little bit of experience, or maybe you're just not really sure what it's all about. I actually first learned about Trapunto when I was in grade school, and I watched my aunt teach my sister how to do it, and they did it all by hand. And once they got that hand needle out, I really wasn't interested because I wanted to do it by machine. And now years later, I've discovered a lot of different ways that you can do Trapunto, and it's actually not just for quilting. So let's get started. This is going to be our adventure path. I'm going to start with a little definition and history. I'm going to review some basic supplies, and then we're going to visit 8 different techniques. And then at the end, we're going to have some questions. Now, we've got a lot of ground to cover, so just remember this webinar is being recorded, and you can go back and watch the parts that you missed. Plus, there's a handout that you can download that has links, a list of your basic supplies, and other tips to help you on your way. I'm not actually going to show you how to do a complete project, but walk you through the projects that I created using the Trapunto technique. Now, I do want to tell you I do not have a PhD in Trapunto. In fact, there may be some of you out there who know a lot more about it than I do. But I'm hoping we can all learn from the things I'm going to share with you. And when you start on your creative journey and you find a way that you like to do it, go ahead and do it because it's going to be your project. So let's start with the definition. According to Merriam-Webster, Trapunto is a decorative quilted design in high relief worked through at least 2 layers of cloth by outlining the design in a running stitch and then padding it from the underside. Dictionary.com says that it's quilting having an embossed design produced by outlining the pattern with single stitches and then padding it with yarn or cotton. So basically, you have a quilt with sections of extra batting to make a raised area. And it's also known as Italian or stuffed quilting. And I found out apparently I've been pronouncing this word wrong all of my life. I've always called it Trapunto, but in the dictionary and when I went online to figure out, how to pronounce it correctly, it actually is Trapunto, or actually Trapunto. So you're saying that second syllable a little differently. And I'm going to try to say it correctly, but when you've said a word a certain way all your life, it's sometimes kind of hard to change, but we all know what I'll be talking about. These are some books that I used as I started exploring Trapunto, and they are listed for you on your handout. The first one is Exploring Machine Trapunto by Harry Wallner, and it's just got some wonderful ideas and patterns for creating your own designs. The second book by Geta Grama is Shadow Trapunto Quilts, and what caught my eye was how different it looked, and it is definitely a different technique. And then the third book was recently gifted to me, and it's by Mary Morgan and Dee Mosteller, called Trapunto and Other Forms of Raised Quilting. And if you really want to get into the history and more details about it, this would be the book for you. And then I had two other resources, my good friends Google and YouTube. I took a deep dive and watched lots of videos and read lots of things on the internet. So if you want to do that, make sure you pour yourself a large cup of coffee, because one video leads to another, and you'll be amazed at the different things that are out there. So a little bit of history. Trapunto has been around for a long time. This picture here is from the Victoria and Albert Museum, and it's an image of the Tristan quilt, which was made in the late 14th century on linen, and it was all done by hand. And it's just beautiful. Now, some of the things I read said that Trapunto had actually been around longer than that, but because we're working with textiles, they don't always stand the test of time. So it's exciting that we have something that's this old. Now, this quilt, the Tristan quilt, was a wedding gift to two of Sicily's aristocracy, and it has scenes from the legend of Tristan and Isolde, a classic bit of medieval courtly love and tragedy. So definitely an interesting wedding gift. While I was on the Victoria and Albert Museum website, I found some other images of Trapunto, and isn't this corset interesting? So an undergarment, but having all that detailed stitching. And then this early 20th century dress, the skeleton dress, cording was used to make the Trapunto, and it mimics the skeleton, and I thought that was very unique. And then the hat I found on Pinterest was just lovely. So when you think about all the handwork that goes into making Trapunto, you can certainly understand why these textiles were often seen in the homes of the wealthy. Now, are any of you Trekkies? I will admit to being a little one. And according to Wikipedia, this uniform from Star Trek II Wrath of Khan has a Trapunto collar. So I guess way off in the 24th and 25th centuries, they still have Trapunto. So how is it done? Early examples show that two pieces of fabric were stitched together without batting. Then the fibers on the back were separated and stuffing was carefully inserted into those areas. If we couldn't separate the fibers, then a small cut had to be made so that the stuffing could be inserted. And then, of course, that opening had to be mended. Detail stitching was added in the flat areas, and sometimes cording was used as the stuffing. The padding and stuffing in early works were normally of cotton, wool, or flax. Wool padding and stuffing were often soaked in vinegar to prevent iron rust and vermin infection in quilted armor, and maybe to keep the evil spirits away. I'm thinking with enough vinegar, that would probably keep the enemy away as well. So let's talk about basic supplies that we would use in the 21st century to make our Trapunto. First of all, your top fabric needs to be supple enough to allow the extra padding to raise the design. If you work with a really stiff fabric, it's just going to be harder to puff up. So think quilting cotton, silk, dress weight, and so on. If you're using a fabric with twill weaves or line textures like corduroy, that can detract from a small Trapunto design. And if you want to go for that authentic look, use white or light colored fabrics. So let's talk a little bit about pre-washing. You can pre-wash your cotton fabrics, especially if it's going to be for a garment or if the fabric is heavily dyed. You do want to make sure that your fabric can go in water, because the technique we're going to use involves wash away thread, and we do need to use water to remove it. If you think the batting in the middle layer is going to shrink, then you would want to pre-wash it according to the package directions. But you do not need to pre-wash the polyester high loft batting because it's not going to shrink. So what did I do? I did not pre-wash my cotton batting because it said right on the package that it didn't need it. It wasn't going to shrink. On my garment projects, I did pre-wash those fabrics. And down the road, if I'm going to wash, say, anything quilted, it's going to be on gentle, and I may damp dry it and lay it flat to finish air drying. And you should always test and do what works best for you. And you're going to see one project where I definitely could not wash it. So we're talking about washing, and the reason is we are going to be using wash-away thread for basting around the Trapunto design. I only used it in the needle and then used a lightweight 60-weight cotton thread in the bobbin. Wash-away thread does come on different size spools. Some quilters like to use it for basting their quilts. But for small projects, I think you will find that a small spool of wash-away thread will be really good to get you started. And a note of caution. Be sure to mark and store the wash-away thread as wash-away. You certainly don't want to get it mixed up with your construction thread. And don't ask me how I know that. Now, as far as the quilting, those threads are up to you. I used a variety. I used 50 and 60 weight cotton threads. On one project, I used some monofilament, and another project, I used some 40 weight embroidery thread. So it's whatever you want to use on your project. And of course, your needle choice is going to match your thread and fabric choices. However, I did have very good success using a 90-14 top stitch needle when working with the wash-away thread. And then for the rest of my projects, I use an 80-12 Microtex. You're going to be using two types of batting. You'll need some fluffy batting for the Trapunto part, and I use this Polyfill High Loft polyester batting. And it doesn't have to be the size of your entire project because you're only going to be putting it in certain areas. And then when you get ready to quilt the finished project, you will need some thin cotton batting like this Warm and Natural. And of course, you're going to need your sewing machine. You do need a sewing machine that allows you to drop the feed dogs when you do the free motion stitching. And I use the B880 Plus. I love having that 12 inches of space to the right of the needle, just allowing for more movement of my fabric. And of course, if you've got a quilting machine, such as the sit-down Q16 and Q20 or the Q24 on the frame, that's going to be perfect for your quilting as well. I did a lot of my quilting on the Q20, and I really liked having 2 stitch regulators to make it easy to do my work. But a basic sewing machine is going to be perfect if you're just starting out. Now we do need to talk a little bit about the feet. I use the free motion embroidery foot number 24. I really like this foot because it's open in the front and I could really see where I was stitching. Another option is the adjustable stippling foot number 73. What's really nice about this foot is it has a dial on it so you can adjust its height, especially when you're working with the thicker battings. You want to make sure that the foot is just skimming the fabric. If it's too high, you're going to skip stitches, and if it's too low, it's going to drag on your quilt. The Bernina stitch regulator is going to be perfect when you're doing the free motion quilting on your machine because it senses the movement of the fabric and keeps your stitches nice and even. I think the clear sole will be the best for working with the fluffy batting. It kind of compresses the batting down a little bit, making it easier to stitch. And there are markings on it, so if you are trying to guide along a certain spot, you can easily see that. And then you can switch to the closed toe or open toed sole when you go to your regular quilting. It should also be noted that the stitch regulator can be used on the Bernina 450 on up. So quite a range of machines that you can use it on. And of course, you're going to want to put your straight stitch plate on for both your piecing and your quilting. You are going to get the best stitches when you use this plate. Scissors are going to be really important for this technique. The ones on the left are called applique scissors, or you may know them as duckbill scissors. That curved end is going to slide between the batting and the fabric, while the pointed end is on the top. And this is going to prevent you from nipping into that lower fabric. I also liked using these Karen K. Buckley scissors when I needed to get into some narrow points, because they have a fine tip and easily get into where I need to go. And then for all the rest, you're going to need your basic sewing supplies. And as we go along, I'm going to mention some additional items related to particular techniques. So let's get going on our adventure. So I will tell you, when I first was considering presenting this webinar, my Trapunto experience wasn't very large. And who do you call when you have a question? You call your mom. So I called her and I said, hey, have you ever done Trapunto before? And she said, well, yes, I have. And she sent me a picture of this pillow, and it's actually a panel. So this is a great place to start because you have defined areas that you can trace with your needle and then use those areas to fill in for the Trapunto. So I said, that's where I'm going to start as well. So what I started with was a Christmas stocking. The panel I used is Santa Express large stocking panel from Maycower, UK. What I did was I rough cut around one of the stockings and then layered it with the high loft batting. I inserted the 90-14 top stitch needle and threaded it with the wash away thread. And then the 60 weight cotton thread was in the bobbin. And then I started by stitching inside the outline, as you can see on this picture. And the reason I did that is when you trim the batting, you're not going to be able to get it smack dab on that stitching line, but it's going to extend out a little bit. So when we go back and stitch on the outlines after it's trimmed, it's actually going to fill in that space all the way to the outline. And here you see I'm using foot number 24, but you could also use your Bernina stitch regulator. So you're going to stitch around all the areas that you want to be highlighted with the Trapunto. Then you're going to flip the project over and go ahead and trim away all the excess batting close to the stitching. And here you see that my duckbill scissors, that curved part is in between the batting and the fabric, and the sharp part of my scissors is along the top. You do want to do this on a flat surface. Doing this in your lap would not be a good idea because you run the risk of the fabric buckling up and then you end up nipping it. Then go ahead and remove the wash away thread from your machine, replace the needle and the bobbin with your quilting thread and your quilting needle of choice. Then you're going to make a quilt sandwich as before with normal quilts. So you'll have your thin layer of cotton batting and then your backing. And now you can see I'm stitching right on the outline around my design. And I'm going to go ahead and stitch all around those areas where I had the puffy batting. You want to quilt in between these areas as densely as you can to really make that Trapunto pop. And I use stippling, but you can use any quilting technique that you like. I do recommend that you shorten your stitch length when using small stipples because that's going to make your curves much nicer. I also added some detail stitching. If you look in the upper right of the photograph, you can see that I went around the door of the house and then added some detail stitching on the holly leaves and berries of the snowman. And that's just a fun thing to do. So you're going to stitch all of those down. And when it's done, you're going to take the panel before you finish sewing it, and you're going to soak it for a couple of minutes in tepid water and then lay flat to dry. And this is going to dissolve your wash away thread. You might need to swish it just a little bit. It can happen that you could see some of the bobbin thread poking up, and I've got a little bit poking up I can see in the lower right. And what you do is just grab your tweezers and pull that out. Now, if you wanted, you could use wash away thread in the bobbin, but it really isn't necessary because the 60 weight thread isn't going to add a lot of bulk. So once it's dry, you're going to assemble your stocking. And I really wish you could see this in person because it's hard to appreciate the texture of Trapunto in the photograph. And I thought it was a fun way to quilt a panel. There are so many wonderful panels out there, and this would be a fun way to add some detail instead of just doing an all-over stitching technique on them. Okay, so I have my first one under my belt. I've practiced. What else could I do? Well, I spied these large scale prints at my local quilt store, and I thought, well, it would be really fun to use those as my Trapunto elements. I still have something to trace, but it's a little different than a panel. This fabric is from Moda, and it's the Flowers for Freya collection. And I just made a simple table runner of 3 squares and then some sashing and an inner border and an outer border. So the first thing I did was assembled the table runner top. Then I put the high loft batting under the blocks where I was going to do the trapunto, and again used the wash away thread and the needle to stitch around some of the motifs. Now you'll notice I didn't stitch around all the flowers. Some I'm going to leave flat and some I'm going to have the trapunto effect added. Then I went in and trimmed the batting. Now don't stress about getting super close if you miss some spots, because sometimes it's hard to get into the valleys. When you go back and do your quilting, you can really quilt in those areas and tack that batting down. So then I've layered my table runner with my thin cotton batting and the backing fabric, and now I'm going to quilt around the outside of the flowers. And you can see on this image, the wash away thread is on the inside part of the flowers and the quilting stitches is right on the outline. I did go in and stitch around the center just to make it interesting. And I also stitched around the flat flowers just so that they could be defined. And again, soak in some water and lay flat to dry. And then you'll finish with quilting and binding. Now for the quilting this time, I thought I would try some ruler work. And if you haven't tried ruler work yet, a table runner is a perfect place to start. It's a small project and you'll love the results. You will want to use a ruler foot. Ruler foot number 96 is used on our Q series machines, and the adjustable ruler foot number 72 can be used on our domestic machines. There's also a new foot, the adjustable ruler foot 72 with a slit, which makes it super easy to switch feet between techniques. Now the rulers I used are from Amanda Murphy, and you've probably seen that clamshell before that I did in the inner border, but the daisy is a new ruler. And what I chose to do in the outer border was just quilt half daisies, and I was really pleased with the effect. So now you have a table runner with some added texture. So my next idea down the road is I think it would be fun to quilt a baby quilt using Trapunto, because often the baby fabrics and the baby panels have large areas that are just asking for some detailed stitching. And I think a baby would love feeling those different heights and textures in the project. But now I've started playing with my rulers and I wondered, could I do Trapunto with my rulers? And I found out that I could. So this is a silk pillow and I quilted it with Amanda Murphy's Good Measure rulers, and these are the lollipop rulers and they come in 2 sizes. So let me show you how that worked. Now I did not pre-wash the silk, but I did look it up on the internet because I was worried about silk, whether or not I could wash it or not, and it can be washed, so I can put it in water to remove the wash away thread. I did put some Shape Flex fusible interfacing on the back just to give it some added stability. And I started with a rectangle that was larger than my pillow form. Now to get these diamonds in the spots where I wanted, I went ahead and used some chalk and marked a grid. And this is about a 3-inch grid. I'm back to my wash away thread with the 9014 needle, and I've got the high loft batting underneath the silk. And what I did was I stitched the diamonds as motifs without connecting stitches between them. Then I alternated sizes as well for this geometric look. Flipped it over and again trimmed around the diamonds with my duckbill scissors. Then made a quilt sandwich with thin batting and backing fabric. Now because I didn't have a printed design, I used the edge of my foot to guide along the stitching I had done with the wash away thread to define the diamonds. and then went back. Well, actually, as I did the diamonds, then I would stipple on to the next diamond, filling in the whole pillow. Now, I did make sure when I was going to get rid of the wash away thread that I soaked the entire pillow front. Sometimes it can happen that silks and satins can get water spotting, so I thought I'm going to be consistent. I got the whole thing wet to get rid of the wash away thread. And then I assembled the pillow. And I decided, since I made a silk pillow, I just wanted the finish to be professional. And I used the invisible zipper foot number 35 to put an invisible zipper along the bottom seam. And if you haven't tried an invisible zipper, you really should check it out because it is the easiest zipper that you can put in. All right, so we've done a panel. We've done large motif fabrics. We've explored ruler work. The fourth technique I'm going to show you is shadow trapunto. Now, this book is by Geta Grama, and she's from Romania, and she is self-taught. You really need to visit her website to see the stunning quilts and projects that she has made with shadow work. And I've got a couple of pictures here. The first quilt on the left, Summer Rain, is only 38 inches square. So picture that in your mind as you look at the intricate detail that she has done with her trapunto work. The cushion and the small bag are also very pretty. But this next picture is amazing. This is her quilt, A World of Many Colors, and it won honorable mention in Houston about 9 years ago. I just cannot get over the level of detail that she put into this trapunto quilt. Well, I wanted to try trapunto, but I was not ready to try anything this fancy. And if this is your first time trying it, start with something simple. And I just made a little block using a Hawaiian applique motif. You're going to use white organza, which is going to be the layer on the top. And the batting, instead of being underneath the cotton fabric, is actually going to rest on top of the cotton fabric with the organza over it. So you're going to see that polyester batting. You do want to choose a cotton fabric that's bold in color because it is going to be muted a little bit through the organza, and you do not want to pre-wash the organza. It is a little stiff, and that's the way you want it to be. Other sheer fabrics can be used, such as batiste or voile. You can iron the organza, but you want to be careful. Steam is okay, but you don't want the iron to be really hot. And if you do have some creases or wrinkles that you can't get out, don't worry about it, because once you start quilting, they're going to go away. You're going to need a paper template for this type of work. The Hawaiian applique design that I used is actually from the applique section of the BERNINA version 8 software in the quilting application section. So if you haven't checked that out in your software, you do want to take a look at it. Not only are there quilt blocks, but there are applique patterns as well that you can size for your needs. So the way this sandwich is in this photograph is on the bottom layer is the polyester high loft batting, then the organza, and then the paper template. Remember, the batting is on the bottom. And you're going to stitch it just as we did before with that 9014 needle and the wash away thread in the needle. Stitching inside the lines. I did reduce my stitch length to 2 millimeters. That made it easier to tear the paper away. And you do want to be careful while you're removing the paper. You don't want to yank on it because that can distort your stitches. Tweezers will also be helpful if you have any stubborn bits of paper that you can't get rid of. And then we're going to trim the batting as before. And this is where I used my really sharp scissors because I have some really deep little valleys that I couldn't get my duckbill scissors into. And I can't emphasize enough, work on a flat surface. That organza, it's a fine fabric and it's very easy to nip. However, if you accidentally cut it, just mark it with some thread, and when you go back and quilt, quilt over it, and nobody's going to know. So now we're going to make our quilt sandwich. So starting from the bottom, you have your backing fabric, then your cotton batting, and then your the top fabric, and then your organza and polyester batting. So you are actually going to be seeing the polyester batting on your finished project. And this time I chose to use monofilament thread because I really didn't want to see the quilting thread. You want to stitch next to your trapunto, and you want to make sure that the batting goes inside the design. You want to avoid any pokies coming out because that will show up a little bit on your fabric. And I also tried a snowflake design because I thought, well, I did a simple design. Let me try a little more intricate one. And it was a lot more work trimming out the batting, but I had to give it a try. Once you finish the quilting, again, you soak it and finish it as normal. So what kind of technique are you going to try? All right, so now we've been working with Trapunto on fabrics, which we've probably all heard of. Let's step out of the box a little bit. How about leather? When you're working with less supple fabrics, you have to alter your technique, and this is going to be corded Trapunto. I found this belt on Etsy, and you can see the lines of cording along the bottom edge of the belt. High loft batting is not going to raise the leather up, so the cording is what you're going to turn to. Now, how many of you have made this Diva frame wallet before? It's been around for a while, and we've been making it out of fabric and cork. And I thought, what about leather? And I did happen to have a scrap of leather in my stash, and I thought I would give it a try. And you can see that I'm just adding a subtle detail to the wallet. Also note as we go along that I am making sure that that cording is not going anywhere near the top because putting it in under the hardware would be difficult. Now this time I am not going to be using wash away thread because there's no batting that I'm going to be trimming. And with the leather I had, the 8012 Microtex needle worked really well, and I used black thread on the maroon vinyl or the maroon leather because I wanted that contrast. I used Creative Consultant on my B880 and selected seaming on leather, and then my machine adjusted tensions and stitch length for me. However, the machine did recommend that I use a non-stick foot, which normally on leather would be a good idea. However, I wanted to make sure I could get right next to the cording, and the leather roller foot number 55 was just the ticket. So again, I want to remind you that you want to choose leather that is soft and supple. We've all felt different kinds of leather, and you've probably felt that really hard, stiff stuff. I probably wouldn't even go there. But this nice soft leather, or it could be a faux leather or a vinyl. You'll cut it a few inches bigger than your pattern directions, and you do want to layer it with some poly mesh cutaway stabilizer because the cording is going to be sandwiched in between. Now my cords are going to be on an angle, so I marked the ends for the first line of stitching and then stitched connecting those lines through the leather and stabilizer. So now there's no cording in, just that line of stitching. Then I took a length of 3/16 inch wide cotton cord and I snugged it right next to that first line of stitching. And then using the leather roller foot, I guided the needle so it was right next to the cording, but not stitching on the cording. And also notice that my cord is longer than the leather. It's always good to work with more than you need than to catch yourself short. And then add as many cords as you desire. So I just have a total of 3 on my wallet. And then you're going to trim the leather to size and construct your wallet just according to the directions. And I was really pleased with the result. Just added a little detail to it and was fun to experiment with Trapunto on leather, a little unexpected. Okay, so we've explored some various sewing techniques. There might be some machine embroiderers out there and you're wondering, well, can I do Trapunto in my machine embroidery? And the answer is yes. OESD has a couple of really nice collections, and I've listed them for you on your handout. There is Christmas Trapunto 12317 and Trapunto Seashells 12396, and they are super easy to stitch. And when you purchase the patterns, they do include a handout showing you how to go through the steps of creating Trapunto in your embroidery machine. And let me just summarize that for you. Each design is made in two parts. Design A is the pillow or the batting design. This is what's going to be using your high loft batting. And then B is going to be the stitching design. So you will need to make sure you load both the A and the B design onto your machine. And the pillow design is going to be stitched first. So you're going to hoop your tearaway stabilizer, and then you can just lay in a piece of the high loft polyester batting and use matching thread and needle thread and bobbin and stitch the pillow design. I do recommend that you use the free motion couching foot number 43. It's going to really glide nicely over the fibers. Sometimes battings can have little loops sticking up, and you really don't want your number 26 foot getting caught under one of those. So once it's stitched, you're going to remove the design from the hoop, remove the stabilizer, and then trim close to the stitching. Now, isn't this easy? You're not having to worry about cutting any fabric that's underneath. I love that part. Now you're going to load design B. You're going to hoop your backing fabric and thin batting with the backing on the bottom. You do not need any stabilizer. You're going to put washaway thread in both the needle and the bobbin this time, and that's going to help reduce bulk. I would also suggest that you slow your machine speed down a little bit. And then you'll first stitch a placement line, and then you will layer that pillow that you had stitched in design A. Then you will take your top fabric and place it right side up. And if you want to use a bit of temporary adhesive spray to hold it in place, that's quite all right. And then there's going to be a basting stitch just to hold everything together. Then you're going to remove the washaway thread from your needle and bobbin and switch to your normal embroidery thread. And the design is going to stitch out completely. Now, if you want, you can then remove this from the hoop and add some free motion stitching to really help that design pop. So this was a really fun technique, and what I did with the design was I put it on a bag, and it just added a nice detail that was a little different from regular embroidery. And now with the holidays coming up, I bet you can think of a lot of fun things to do with that Christmas trapunto. Can you make trapunto in embroidery without a special trapunto design? And the answer is yes. This technique I learned from Sarah Caldwell, who's the Education and Training Manager for BERNINA International. And you can see there is just a subtle trapunto effect, but this is not a trapunto design. And let me show you how that was done. It's a triple stitch design, so you definitely don't want to use anything that's a heavy satin stitch design. And I layered my fabric and a thin cotton batting and stabilizer and stitched the design, then removed everything from the hoop and trimmed around. Now I did not worry about removing all that stabilizer that's underneath the embroidery, because that's really not going to be a factor in your finished project. Now we are using thin cotton batting, so the design raised effect is going to be subtle. But then you're going to layer and quilt as before, and you can see where I stitched around the whole design first. And in this example, I actually did grid quilting, and I still got the effect of the trapunto. Now, if you're wondering about these designs, these come with our BERNINA Crystal Edition machines. And folks that get those machines have the opportunity to take a class to learn how to make a quilt or a bag or a blouse, and the bag and the quilt have this trapunto technique. But now that I've shown you how to do it, you can go try it yourself. Now, do any of you have software? Did you know you could create a trapunto effect in your software? And yes, you can. In our version 7, version 8, and version 9 Designer Plus, we have the opportunity to create trapunto. These two designs come with the software, and they are in the software's 3D folder. The rose is a raised satin stitch, and it can be stitched just as it is without any extra fabric added to the top. And then the Trapunto quilt design actually goes through the whole step of making a Trapunto look project. So let's see how that works. The Trapunto effect is created using a raised satin stitch, and you can adjust the amount of layers of the stitching. So you would have your design, and then in the bottom toolbar of your software, you have the option to pick raised satin, and then in object properties, you can adjust the number of layers. Now, if all of a sudden you're thinking, how am I going to remember this? Remember, your software does have a reference manual, and there is a section under 3D embroidery that will walk you through the steps. In the Edit toolbar on the left-hand side, you will find the Create Trapunto Outline option. And what that does is then adds an outline around your design after you have placed your top fabric in place. So what's really great is in software, the Trapunto effect is created by thread, not batting, so no trimming is required. Well, I wanted to try this, so let me show you what I did. I used it to create a band on this child's dress. The pattern I'm using is Lily by Olive Ann Designs, and it's a multi-size girl's dress pattern and includes a matching doll pattern. And I just altered it a little bit to add a band, and let me show you how I made that. I first of all scanned my fabric into the software because I wanted to make a design based on the motifs. I digitized each petal separately and then the flower center. Now, right now you see it as a step fill, but I did then go into the bottom toolbar and convert this to a raised satin. Then I edited and duplicated as desired. Here's an important tip. When you're working with multiple objects, be sure to set the design up so that the center one stitches first. I have an example of what happens when you don't do that. And then use object properties to determine the number of layers for your satin fill, and I chose 4. Then with everything selected, click on the Create Trapunto Outlines in the Edit toolbox, and a new dialog box will show up. And here you can choose whether you want your outline type to be a single or a triple stitch. You can adjust the offset, and the software automatically assigns a new color because you do want the machine to stop so that you can place your layer of fabric on top of the stitching. Now, I also wanted to apply a quilting background because, you know, before we were doing some free motion stitching. Well, I'm in embroidery and I want the embroidery machine to do it. So right above the Create Trapunto Outlines option, you see quilting backgrounds. And when you click on that, it walks you through adjusting a block size, choosing your quilting type. You can change the size of the stitching and so on. If you're making this for a garment, you do want to make sure that you make your quilt block, which was my rectangle band, larger than the pattern size so you have room to trim. So this is what my design looks like at this point. I have my 3 raised satin flowers. The red stitching is the outline for the Trapunto, and then you see my quilting stitches. And this is all going to be done in the embroidery hoop. It did take a couple of attempts to figure out how I really wanted to do this. So I did increase my stitch layers to 4 because I did want a more raised look. And the first one attempt, I used a single layer of wash-away stabilizer as recommended. And you can see how the stabilizer is pulling apart a little bit. But the design is not falling out because it is still connected a little bit. So I tried it again with 2 layers and I still had some pulling, but it wasn't as bad and I was happy with it. Now I did stitch a test band. So I put a layer of fabric on the top and the bottom and did the Trapunto, but I really wasn't happy with the hand of it. It felt kind of stiff because I had quilting stitches, but I really didn't have any batting in there. So let's go to attempt number 2. So for we won't call it an attempt, we'll call it a test. So I hooped some thin batting and a layer of fabric on the bottom, and stitched my flowers. Now here's where I made my boo-boo. I forgot to set the design so that the center flower would stitch first. So you can see the pulling and the puckering. Now I went ahead and finished the design with the top layer of fabric, but trust me, the quilting did not make those puckers go away. So this is an important thing to remember. Always work from the center out. So attempt number 3. This time I made sure I changed the stitching order. And also I thought, I'm going to be putting this in a dress, and the dress is going to have a lining. So I'm going to try and do it without a backing fabric because I know the lining is going to cover this in the end. So I just stitched this on some thin batting. And yeah, it pulled a little bit, but it was still holding together and nothing was falling apart. So I decided to go for it. I wasn't going to panic. So the raised satin stitching happened first, and then the machine stopped. I placed my top fabric on, and I changed the thread colors for the outlines to blue to match the dress, and then used thread to match the white fabric for the quilting, and then assembled the dress. And I thought it turned out really well. There is a lining, and maybe you're thinking, well, she didn't really quilt those flowers in between 2 layers of fabric. So I put the dress in the wash to see what would happen, and it was just fine. So I thought it was a fun way to apply Trapunto to a non-quilting project. And I think my granddaughter's going to look pretty cute in this dress. All right, so one last thing. This is not quite Trapunto, but it kind of fits the theme. Did you notice the stitching at the top of the stocking I showed you at the beginning? That's actually 3D lettering. Have you ever tried that? It is really a neat standout effect. So in the BERNINA software, you have some special fonts that are called 3D fonts, and they are designed to be stitched over foam, such as this sulky puffy foam. You do want to choose a foam to match the thread. It doesn't have to be an exact match, but in the color family. Now, 3D lettering is often seen on ball caps, and they're not often washed. And this is a product you probably wouldn't wash, or if you had to, it would be carefully hand washing. The foam is about a 2 millimeter thickness, and notice that I am using the free motion couching foot again as I'm working over these thick layers. So you're going to stitch your lettering and then carefully pull the foam away after stitching. And I love the effect. Now, you could, if you wanted to, go ahead and create Trapunto outlines and put fabric over the top and give it that look. But I like that bold lettering showing at the top of my stocking. So that brings us to the end of our exploration of Trapunto. I hope you were inspired by some of these different projects. And Randy, do we have any questions?
So far, yeah, we don't have anything right now, so I think we're good.
Okay. Well, thanks again, folks, for joining us. Remember, this recording is going to be posted next week, so you can go back and dive in again. And I hope you'll explore Trapunto yourselves. Happy sewing.